Welcome back to Roadside History. Today I'm in Idaho, not far from the town of Franklin, Idaho. I'm high above a bluff looking into a valley, and I'll explain to you why I'm doing that. I'm going to tell you a tragic story about a group of Native Americans who lived in the area in the 1800s. They were known as the band of the Northern Shoshone Indians. And they came to this area north of what's today Cache Valley in Utah. They came to this area and would encamp traditionally here along the Bear River. This would be their winter encampment area along the Bear River, where there was an abundance of game to feed their families, as well as water where they could fish and feed their families. This group of people, their land would extend all the way up into the Wind River Range in Wyoming and into parts of Nevada. But anyway, I'm here to tell you a little story about them and the tragic events that happened in 1863 at the hands of a man by the name of Colonel Patrick Connor, who led a group of California volunteers based out of Fort Douglas, just above the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. It's important to understand, before I tell you this story, this event that took place, it's important to understand a little bit about why maybe this situation took place and the tragic events unfolded. In the 1820s, the Cache Valley, which it's an incredibly fertile valley with rivers running through it. Today there's a lot of farmland, but back in the 1820s and 1830s, this was an area that was a grassland where the grass grew wild and fed a lot of game, and so a lot of game came into the area, which of course made it the ancestral hunting grounds of the Northern Shoshone people. Well, as more and more trappers came into the area in the 1820s, and then of course because of the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, people trying to get out west to hit gold mining, or even up in Montana to do some gold mining, as more and more settlers came through the area, and Mormon settlers who were south of Cache Valley came into the area. As more settlers came into the area, they began to encroach on these sacred hunting grounds that the Northern Shoshone people had been utilizing for hundreds and hundreds of years. This led to conflict. There was a lot of misunderstanding between the two groups as well. Native Americans didn't quite understand the cultures of the Americans and the settlers that were coming through, and the settlers didn't understand the cultures of the Native Americans. And this led to conflict. Skirmishes would outbreak. There tended to be you do something to our people, we'll do something to your people type situations took place quite regularly. The Plains Indian Wars had been going on already for a tremendous amount of time, but because of the Civil War in the 1860s, not a lot of attention has been played on what took place out here in this situation specifically with regards to the Bear River Massacre. But in any event, as the number of settlers were coming in and encroaching on this ancestral hunting ground and camping areas that these Native American, these Northern Shoshone had occupied for hundreds and hundreds of years, conflict was bound to break out. And of course it did. In 1863, conflict is going to erupt. And let me give you a little bit of background. At the time, Colonel Patrick Connor commanded a group of soldiers based out of Stockton, California. They were known as the 3rd California Volunteers. And these volunteers, they were a little disappointed they didn't get action in the Civil War. They were actually sent to Salt Lake City to protect the overland mail routes. And so that's what they did. Well, as skirmishes between the settlers and the Native Americans continued to happen, you started to see Colonel Connor take an opportunity, if you will, to address these skirmishes. He was addressing concerns from leaders in Salt Lake City about some of the conflicts that had transpired between the white settlers and the Native Americans. And so on January 21st, 1863, Colonel Connor and his men left Salt Lake City. Now, a few days earlier, about 200 other men had left to find the Bear River and to find these encampments of these northern Shoshone. Now, the northern Shoshone had populated and gathered in a large number of different tribes. A number of northern Shoshone had come to this area because it was a yearly thing where they would come and they would prepare to celebrate for the coming of spring. Some concern happened. One medicine man had had a vision that a great battle took place and a number of his people were killed. And so a lot of them left the area and found other winter encampments. But there were about 75 to 80 groups of families that stayed at this winter encampment just below the bluff from where I'm standing today. In the bitterly cold early morning hours of January 29th, 1863, Chief Sagwitch arose and stepped outside of his tent, and he noticed on the bluff what he thought was a mist coming down off the bluff, but a closer analysis would show these were soldiers on horseback coming down off the bluff. Now, Chief Sagwitch knew, as did Bear Hunter, who was another northern Shoshone, they knew that conflict was on the horizon. In fact, Chief Sagwitch had tried to negotiate a peace so that they could avoid any type of conflict. But as these individuals, as these U.S. infantrymen came down from the bluff, the valley and the river would become essentially a death trap to the northern Shoshone. From one side, and I'm going to show you here, I'm going to turn the camera around. From one side over here on the bluff, you can see here, where the soldiers came down, the encampment was over here, you can see in this green fertile area. As the soldiers came down off this bluff and began to pursue toward the encampment, there was another group of soldiers that were right off of this bluff over here, making their way down toward the encampment of Native Americans. And it's really a tragic event. Connor's troops came through right over there, as I mentioned to you earlier. And from this side that you're seeing over here, this is where you see Hoyt and McGarry. Hoyt and McGarry were soldiers that led, they led a group of soldiers in this conflict as well. But as they came down, as they advanced from this area down into here, and the other soldiers came from this area into here, the Native Americans that were left in this area had nowhere to go. The U.S. soldiers opened fire on them, and there didn't seem to be any intention to find peace. No stopping to talk or to parley or anything along those lines. The U.S. soldiers attacked, and naturally, to defend themselves and their lives, the northern Shoshone fought back. Many fled to the river and were drowned in the river, and of course the U.S. military had far superior weaponry. Of course, they had gunpowder and far more sophisticated weapons than the northern Shoshone happened. And what would escalate would be a terrible event. Over 400 men, women, and children from the northern Shoshone Indians would be killed. Many of them were killed in hand-to-hand combat, including children and women. Some were drugged from the willows from outside of the river and brought over and killed. It was a horrific situation that took place, and probably something that could have been avoided had there been better dialogue going back a few years and better understanding of each other's cultures. But nonetheless, on that cold January morning, that massacre and battle would begin. And it was a horrible thing. 23 U.S. soldiers would be killed. You know, as part of this massacre, I mentioned the 75 or 80 Native American lodges that were down here in this valley. After this 4-hour fight took place, and that's about the length of what it was, 4 hours, so many people were killed, men, women, and children. I mentioned the hand-to-hand combat and the vicious murder of Native Americans who were pulled from their encampment and innocently slaughtered out here in the valley. You know, sad as can be, this valley was littered, literally, with roughly 400 souls, and they were left out in this valley, and there was no proper burial, no proper preservation. They were essentially left to the wild animals, which is horrific in and of itself. But it tells of a time in U.S. history that's very sad. You know, the treatment of these Native Americans, these people who were here, and the conflicts between the settlers and these people, which, you know, potentially could have been avoided. Who knows? Maybe I'm saying that because I'm judging past by the present tense, and that's generally not fair. But could these things have been avoided? Could these conflicts have been avoided? Potentially, who knows? But one thing is for sure, this area of land down below this bluff is sacred ground. Many people lost their lives in a horrible act that took place here again on a cold morning on January 29th, 1863. The area in which I'm standing today is the area where the killing field essentially took place, where the battle took place. You can see here behind me, the Bear River is just in front of those trees right there. But that's part of the area, and of course it stretches across this road here. If you're looking this way, there's the valley, and of course there's the bluff where Colonel Connor's men would come down. But this is in large part the killing field where so many people lost their lives in this horrific battle. I read an account of one young boy who said, "My grandma and I laid on the ground and pretended to be dead because they feared, as the U.S. soldiers were coming in and checking for people who were alive, that once they discovered they were alive, that they would be slaughtered." It's a terrible event in American history. It was once called the Battle of Bear River, and then it was subsequently changed about 20 years ago to the Bear River Massacre. I mentioned earlier in my story that during this massacre, people drowned in the river. The river has a good depth to it, but women would take their children trying to get away, trying to get out of the conflict any way they could. In January, in the freezing cold of January, there must have been several feet of snow on the ground, and they got to the river hoping that they could swim across or find safety. Of course, a number of them drowned and died in the river. Some did not. Some made it out. There were some survivors. But you could imagine, in terms of survival, the lengths that people were willing to go to, trying to survive and get out of that conflict and find refuge somewhere outside of the firefight and the storm of death that was coming. The memorial that you're looking at right here is a memorial that commemorates the proximity, the site of the Bear River Massacre. I'm down here in the valley. You can see over there the bluffs where Colonel Connor and his men came down, and of course this area here and across the highway over here is where the battle took place, and so many lost their lives. But I just want to walk you around this memorial that kind of commemorates the events that transpired. You can see over here in a tree, there's a lot of things that have been left in this tree back here. In fact, there's a little sign that says "We will not forget." But again, just kind of some mementos that have been left behind that kind of speak to the sacredness of this ground and what took place here. Of course, I mentioned that this is sacred ground, and it is. So anyway, wanted to show you some of those areas, tell you a little bit about the history of it. I don't typically do stories of massacres and a lot of death because they're not fun. And but I think it's important also that we don't forget history and that we know what took place. As the old cliche says, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And hopefully that never takes place in America or any other country for that matter. But thanks for joining us again on Roadside History. Till next time, have a safe road trip. And if you haven't liked and subscribed to my channel, please do so.